This is the coast of Ventotene, a little island hardly 1 square mile in the Mediterranean Sea, 15 miles from the Italian mainland, beyond the Gulf of Gaeta. Under Roman domination, Ventotene had a time of prosperity due to the voluntary stay or exile of notorious people such as Julia, daughter of Augustus Caesar.
The Borboni of Naples turned it into a penal colony in the 18th century, and after hundreds of years of pirate incursions, Ventotene became, around 1930, an island of exile, of forced residence for the political opponents of the fascist regime.
Ventotene is now a much appreciated tourist center, but it's also the Altiero Spinelli headquarters of the Institute of Federalist Studies. And every year in September, more than 200 young people from all over Europe meet here for a few days of debate and study on European Union, federalism, and international democracy.
From Belgium, I'm coming. Yes. And I hope to learn a lot about federalism and how to realize it in Europe.
We shall hold meetings and conferences. There will be debates on the creation of a government for Europe.
After 10 years spent in fascist prisons, Altiero Spinelli landed in Ventotene in July 1939. 2 months later, the Second World War broke out.
In our forced residence, it was as if we were in the audience in a theater from which we saw what was happening all over Europe. So we were witnessing the progressive collapse of the whole of Europe, except England, under the force of Hitler's attacks. A totally different type of war to what the First World War had been, during which every state had been able to fend for itself. This time they were crushed, and the nation that crushed them, the Germans, were in the end crushed most of all. The old European system had fallen to pieces. The idea that a European federation should be created was well known. Rosselli had said it, and many others as well. However, having said it, they would turn to do something else, as they thought that the creation of a united Europe would happen by itself, by an act of God. Since Ernesto Rossi could correspond with Einaudi, we were able to get some publications of the British Federalists. There was a Federalist movement led by a Lord Lothian, intellectually speaking, an excellent effort. We started to see that someone else had been seriously thinking of the problem of European unity, and we came to the conclusion that the only battle worth fighting was this one. So we wrote this manifesto. It was based on 2 main concepts. First, European federation is not something that will inevitably occur because it's a logical next step. It is something instead that men must fight for and achieve and belongs to our time. The second observation is that the dividing line between the progressive forces and the conservative ones is no longer the traditional one, but lies between those who want to use their power to promote the European construction and those who want to use it to restore the old national system.
Though Spinelli is the first person who clearly sees the need for a specific political struggle for Europe, others within the European resistance had gone along similar roads and had originated federalist projects and organizations.
Among them, we find the students of Christian inspiration in the White Rose movement in Munich, who were beheaded by the Nazi regime for having distributed leaflets requesting a European federation. Jean Moulin, shot by the Nazis in Lyon. Duccio Galimberti, also executed by the Nazi fascists in Italy.
Those whom we may think of as great federalists are generally writers, not politicians. Experts in economics like Einaudi in Italy, Robbins and Lothian in Great Britain, etc. Spinelli is the first to embody federalism as an action project. Since 1941, Spinelli is conscious that the traditional ideologies had been superseded, and federalism became a principle of global political action, going beyond the concept of federalism as a technical tool to describe a way to organize a state.
Spinelli and other Ventotene residents were liberated in August of 1943, soon after Mussolini's fall. 8 days after his return to the Italian mainland, Spinelli founded the European Federalist movement in Milan, in Mario Alberto Rollier's house.
Rossi e Spinelli decisero di
Rossi and Spinelli decided to move to Switzerland to look for the federalist elements in the different resistance movements. I was there too, in Zurich, where I was in charge of the movement in the German-speaking zone of Switzerland. While I came back to Italy, Spinelli went to France. Paris had already been liberated, and contacted the French Federalists, who had also been part of the resistance movement.
May 1945, the war is over. Unemployment and other major difficulties and social disorders shook the European countries. But soon the United States and Russia would intervene and help in the reconstruction of the old system, thereby contradicting Spinelli's expectations. Nevertheless, this system, based on the old borders, only appeared to be solid. Its basic fragility soon showed up, forcing governments to look for some other form of inter-European cooperation.
In September 1946 in Zurich, Churchill already suggested a vague formula for European confederation.
In the meantime, the Federalists got organized and started acting.
We, of course, after all that had occurred during the war with the French, we wanted to symbolize the brotherhood of the two countries. Together with the Federalists of Menton and Nice, we organized a meeting at the border, which nonetheless had not been foreseen by the customs officers, and we had to break through their barriers to be able to embrace each other between the two frontiers.
The governments also started to move. The need for full use of German resources pushed Jean Monnet, a great federalist, into persuading the French government to create the coal and steel community. The CECA, which includes France, Germany, Belgium, Holland, Italy, and Luxembourg, was born.
De Gasperi declared,
European community means a secure peace between France and Germany. It means a modest but permanent function of Italy within the European concert. It means the opening of a common market of labor and gradual access to the common resources. It means, if not the end, at least the compression of national selfishness and the liberation of popular energies.
Right after the Steel and Coal Treaty was signed, the question arose whether to allow Germany to rearm. The governments couldn't think of any new formula. Quite by chance, the intergovernmental project for a European community of defense ended up in the hands of MFE.
Spinelli pinpointed its contradictions. He explained to De Gasperi that lacking a political unity, a European army would fall under the control of the Americans, thus becoming a body of satellite state troops. De Gasperi read Spinelli's memorandum and came to the conclusion that what was needed was the building up of a European state.
De Gasperi, assisted by Einaudi, won over the resistance of the other governments and was able to create a special assembly to draft a constitution.
The Americans backed the project. Eisenhower visited the MFE headquarters in Rome just before his election to the presidency and stated that a European army was not sufficient. A democratic European state and the Constituent Assembly to found it were badly needed.
On August the 30th, 1954, the CED project was rejected by the French National Assembly. Indomitable nationalists, colonialists, Gaullists, and communists united to defeat the pro-European front by a handful of votes.
In June 1955, the 6th MFE Congress met in Ancona. The debate divided the supporters of a line of collaboration with the government's European policy and the Young Turks who wanted to go over to the opposition.
Il dibattito fu molto vivo in quell'occasione.
The debate was hectic, but nonetheless ended with an agreement on a new policy for the Federalists, opposition to the government's line towards Europe. We avoided the split that way, which nonetheless occurred a few years later after the congresses of Bolzano and Luxembourg.
Alcuni anni più tardi, a seguito dei congressi di Bolzano e di Lussemburgo.
In che cosa consiste questo nuovo corso?
What is the meaning of the new course? The Federalists acknowledged that the German problem would be solved by the restoration of the German national sovereignty. This took away the opportunity to build Europe with the traditional political tools. They decided to shift to the opposition, which implied the need to call a new caste onto the scene of the European process, the European people, for whom the Federalists claimed constituent powers. The organizational tool they decided to use was the one Gandhi had used in his battle for the independence of India, the Congress. So the Federalists organized the primary elections of the Congress of the European People, the EPC.
Al Congresso del Popolo Europeo.
The Federalists went into the streets and compelled the Europeans to vote. In Milan, Lyon, Antwerp, Frankfurt, Rome, the European citizens had the opportunity to express their desire for a united Europe. The slogan was, "If you want Europe, vote for it."
It was a big success, but the action was especially important because it demonstrated that it is possible to mobilize the people of Europe in order to achieve political union.
The EPC was in fact the training ground for the last popular demonstrations that the Federalists organized in the 70s and 80s.
While the Federalists fought for the Constituent Assembly, diplomats worked hard to give birth to two new communities, the Economic Community and the Euratom, the treaties of which were signed in Rome in March 1957.
The contradictions within the common market, a neither democratic nor efficient institution, would soon show up, due to the lack of an overall European government and currency.
In the meantime, General de Gaulle came to power in France. Prisoner of the dream of a national past, he was unable to solve the problem of European independence, which he nonetheless invoked.
The Federalists went ahead with their fight against the national governments. On the 14th of July 1965, they broke up the inauguration ceremony of the Mont Blanc Tunnel.
Defying the security services, Sergio Pistone delivered a letter to General de Gaulle and Italian President Saragat with a demand to proceed without delay toward a European federation.
Sergio Pistone, professor at the University of Torino and famous expert on modern history, is still active in the MFE and the UEF, the European organizations which united the various national federalist components. He talks about his experience of those years.
The success of the common market, which was more an appearance than a reality, but was nonetheless much publicized in the media and caught the imagination of the public, made it difficult to maintain an active opposition to the government's European policy. It looked as if all was going well. European economies were booming, and the Federalists who preached the need for a true political union looked like irritating pessimists. It was also difficult to transfer the experiences of Spinellian militant federalism outside Italy.
L'esperienza del federalismo militante, cioè spinelliano, dall'Italia agli altri paesi. Io credo che Francesco Rossolillo può raccontare.
Francesco Rossolillo can best depict the situation at that time.
In fact, it was a difficult experience, which we usually refer to as our long march in the desert. But it was also a very important time as far as the internal debate and the acquisition of political maturity are concerned. In those years, thanks to the experience accumulated in the Congress of the European People, the Federalists held various demonstrations through which they were able to talk to many tens of thousands of citizens while collecting their signatures. This started in Italy, but progressively extended to other countries of the European community, allowing us to strengthen the bonds with other Federalist organizations. Also in those years, thanks to this action, the Federalists rebuilt their supranational unity through a process that culminated in the two Congresses of Nancy in 1972 and Brussels in 1973. On these occasions, together with other active groups from countries of the community and others, the European Union of Federalists was rebuilt as the true supranational organization of all European Federalist forces.
Che costituisce appunto l'organizzazione sovranazionale di tutte le forze federaliste europee.
The institutional treaties of the community provided for a direct election of the European Parliament, but the governments had nominated an assembly of delegates which was more sensitive to their national policies.
On several occasions, the Federalists had contested such a ghostly assembly, and not only with demonstrations such as the one we can see here.
Between the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, war broke out in the Middle East. The oil crisis and Nixon's decision to discontinue dollar parity made it clear to all that the common market was in jeopardy. At that time, the MFE launched the proposal for a direct election of the European Parliament.
In December 1975, on the eve of the European Summit, the Federalists organized a large popular demonstration in Rome to press for a decision on the European election.
During the summit, chaired by Aldo Moro, participants such as Schmidt, Giscard d'Estaing, Wilson, and others had long arguments. They finally agreed upon the proposal for direct election of the Parliament in spite of Great Britain's opposition.
History's first supranational election, initially scheduled for summer 1978, actually took place in June 1979.
The nearly 4 years preceding the direct election of the European Parliament were a period of intense Federalist activity. MFE's goal was that the European elections be coupled with a true European government and a European currency, the sole instrument capable of stabilizing the international economy.
The Federalists won the first allies to their cause. Roy Jenkins, president of the Executive Commission of the EEC, met with the Federalists in Piazza del Duomo in Milan in October of 1978 and congratulated them for their initiative and signed the petition for a European government and currency.
Jenkins first, then Giscard d'Estaing and Schmidt. Towards the end of 1978, several projects came to life for the institution of a common currency, the ECU, European Currency Unit. The resistance of the central banks and of other national centers of power led to a compromise.
The Federalists once again poured into the streets, in Rome and Siena in particular, where on November the 1st, 1978, an Italo-German summit took place. They had cleared the last hurdle. Italy joined the newborn European monetary system.
The ECU is hardly more than an accounting unit. Still, the theme of economical and monetary unity and of a European government vigorously supported by the Federalists would dominate the European debate for the following decade.
June 1979, the vote at last. The elected European Parliament was born. Spinelli accepted an offer to be candidate. He was elected and took the leadership of the Federalist wing of the Parliament. He founded the Crocodile Club and launched the struggle for a treaty that would establish a European Union, a true constituent struggle.
Questo Parlamento non ha però nessun potere.
The Parliament had no power at all. So the only right and fundamental thing it did was to indicate to all the national parliaments and governments that if something serious were to be done, it was necessary to dramatically reform the actual community by creating a union with a true legislative power, a true European government. Creating, in fact, a machine able to decide, where the nation-states would have something to say but could not act independently, something that would negate the whole operation.
After the big success of the 1979 European elections, a debate originated within the EMF, and particularly in its younger section, to focus on the fact that while the direct election of the Parliament draws the European unity nearer, such unity is only a means to reach a higher goal, that is, the federal unity of all mankind. In 1980, when the 10th Congress of MFE convened in Bari, the slogan was European Unity for a United World, and this theme was hotly debated. However, this debate did not keep MFE nor its youth component from fighting to make sure that the elected European Parliament could gain effective legislative powers and actual European unity could be achieved.
Slowly but surely, Spinelli within the Parliament and the Federalists in the towns made sure that the constituent choice prevailed. On the 14th of February 1984, the decisive vote was taken in Strasbourg. 80% of the Parliament sided with Spinelli and approved of the treaty.
On the 25th of May 1984, President Mitterrand of France took a firm position on the treaty. He declared, "Your Assembly invited us to go even further on this path by proposing the project for a treaty that establishes European Union. France is in favor of such an endeavor. Speaking in her name, I declare her ready to examine and defend your project, the inspiration of which she fully shares."
The Milan summit was held. Success seemed at hand, though powerful resistance emerged from nationalist circles to whom the British government gave voice and support. Spring 1985, the foreign ministers met in Stresa, and the young Federalists greeted them with the slogan, "European Union now." While the ministers argued, citizens started mobilizing all over Europe for a big demonstration to take place in Milan in Piazza del Duomo.
The big day came at last. The project for a treaty for a European Union was to be examined by the European Council in Milan on the 28th and 29th of July 1985. Since the MFE Congress in Cagliari and the UEF meeting in Strasbourg, the Federalists in Milan, in Italy, and in Europe had been working hard to face this challenge. Among others, there were 300 young people who paid their own way. They started off from Madrid to be in Milan at dawn on the 29th of June and joined their comrades from all over Europe.
We think that Europe is not only an economical union, but a political one as well.
Europe is a promise which needs to be turned into a reality. That's the reason we're here, to exercise pressure over the representatives of our countries so that they decide to get rid of all social, economical, and political individuality and choose unity.
The time for truth had come. Time to see if the European people really would stand by their parliaments, as the Federalists claimed, and if they were ready to take to the streets to demonstrate in favor of a more united and democratic Europe.
The Europeans turned out in force. Despite the unusually hot and humid weather at the end of June, more than 100,000 people demonstrated in the streets, right from the suburbs to the center of Milan. tens of thousands of flags with the green E on them were waving in the Piazza del Duomo, where the European representatives of the Federalist forces took turns.
The gentlemen who govern us think that Europe does not interest the people, that the man in the street does not know anything about it. Today, we are determined to prove that it's not true, that the common people and the citizens as a whole do support Europe.
For the first time, a mass of people got together in this square to support a united Europe. We can say this is the first supranational mass demonstration.
La prima manifestazione di massa sovranazionale.
In the meantime, the 10 heads of state and heads of governments reached the Castello Sforzesco, protected by an impressive police display.
The Italian and Benelux governments were vociferously in favor of the treaty. Mrs. Thatcher was strongly against it.
At this time, the MFE president, Mario Albertini, took the floor.
Perché noi avremo la realtà dell'Europa quando il nostro diritto di voto diventerà, come deve essere in democrazia, il diritto di decidere la politica europea. Se la politica europea ristagna, se l'Europa non sa battersi per la pace, se l'Europa non sa battersi per eliminare la disoccupazione, se l'Europa non riesce a ottenere la ripresa economica, se l'Europa non riesce a battersi per l'ecologia e per la nuova società, è perché 10 o 12 capi di governo pretendono di governare l'Europa alle spalle dei cittadini, alle spalle del Parlamento europeo. Non saranno mai capaci di governare l'Europa, non saranno mai capaci di governare l'Europa. È il regno dell'assurdo. La battaglia comincia adesso. Fino a ora, cari amici, abbiamo avuto l'Europa dei governi, abbiamo avuto l'Europa degli interessi con il mercato comune. Ci era stato sempre detto che questo è il realismo, ci era stato sempre detto che questo è il pragmatismo. Questa Europa dei governi, questa Europa degli interessi non è nemmeno riuscita a fare la moneta europea nonostante i solenni impegni. Questa Europa unita è meno unita dell'Europa del secolo scorso. Nel secolo scorso un libero cittadino passava le frontiere senza mostrare nessun passaporto a nessuno. L'Europa dei governi, l'Europa degli interessi ha mantenuto in piedi le frontiere. Ma voi vedete cosa sta accadendo? Al Castello Sforzesco questo vertice che noi non accettiamo perché noi vogliamo un governo eletto dal popolo, questo vertice non è capace di fare l'unione, ma non è capace nemmeno di disfare l'unione. Da oggi, con l'ingresso in campo del popolo europeo nella lotta per la costruzione dell'Europa, noi sappiamo di avere un grande spazio aperto davanti a noi. Viva il popolo europeo! Viva il Parlamento europeo! Viva gli Stati Uniti d'Europa!
La règle de l'unanimité pour ces conseils européens a été battue en brèche. 7 pays ont décidé de leur côté de convoquer une conférence intergouvernementale pour rédiger un projet d'Union européenne. Il s'agit des 6 pays fondateurs de la CE et de l'Irlande. Le Danemark, la Grèce et la Grande-Bretagne se sont opposés.
For the first time in the history of the EEC, the unanimity rule had been beaten. But that wasn't enough. During the months that followed, summits were held in Luxembourg and Brussels, where, despite imposing federalist demonstrations, the Union Front dissolved.
The French and German governments supported a compromise position. The Single Act came into being, with a proviso that Mrs. Thatcher could not refuse, to set up a true European single market by 1992.
This at least represented a new opportunity for the Federalists to continue their struggle.
The 23rd of May, 1986, Altiero Spinelli died. His funeral in Rome gave his old friends from the resistance, such as President Pertini, the opportunity to stand side by side with the Federalists. It was an awkward moment. Nevertheless, Spinelli left a message, as Albertini recalls: "Don't give up. The need for Europe is still there, and the Federalists should assume full responsibility for it."
Spinelli had declared in his last public speech at the MFE Central Committee, "It is necessary to find new paths to make the European people's voice heard and have them participate in the struggle for the Union."
On the 2nd of March, 1989, the 14th MFE Congress opened in Rome, 3 months before the third European election took place in June 1989. 3 years had passed since Spinelli's death. The time had come to evaluate what had been done and what still needed to be done.
The single act and the deadline of 1992 kept the theme of European Union in the spotlight. The Federalists didn't miss the opportunity, and again they mobilized their militants.
Spinelli's last message turned into a new initiative, the call for a referendum on the constituent power of the European Parliament.
Signatures were collected in March. In less than 3 months, 100,000 had signed the petition, thanks to campaigns like the one we see here in Assisi.
On June 20th, the proposed bill was handed over to the Parliament. It required a complicated procedure, and several votes were taken.
The last vote took place at the Senate 5 days before Christmas. Unanimity. The referendum would be held together with the June elections.
Still, the Federalists were worried that the people might be misinformed of the referendum and not go to the polls. They organized popular demonstrations.
The next step was that of transferring the success from the Italian to the European front. April the 15th in Florence. More than 200 young people from different European political organizations met for a convention on the theme of the referendum in Italy. They concentrated on how to obtain the same result, that is, a constituent mandate to the European Parliament. In other countries, possibly with different means.
On the night of June 18th, the polls opened. 88% of the Italians said yes to the constituent mandate.
This success exceeded their highest expectations and showed how Spinelli and the MFE were right again.
The first thing I have to say is that in Italy, 30 million citizens were in favor of granting constituent powers to the European Parliament. It was the biggest demonstration of popular will for a political goal ever in Italy. There's never been such a unanimous consensus of opinion before. This weighed on the Italian government and on the members of the European Parliament elected in Italy. From now on, the Italian government had the duty to fight for the constituent mandate to the Euro Parliament in every circumstance, and for the European Council in particular. The European members of Parliament elected in Italy must also support this mandate.
We're almost up to date. The decade ended with great expectations. After the Italian referendum, the Belgian and German parliaments took important votes in favor of the Constituent Front. So has the French President, François Mitterrand. The European Council of Strasbourg vigorously sped up the pace on economic and monetary union. In the meantime, a new responsibility for the European community is forming. The Stalinist regime has collapsed in Eastern Europe. There is now a call for democratic reform.
There is a real possibility that in the 90s, the two sides of Europe will proceed together towards union and the full realization of international democracy.
return to Ventotene, 50 years after the arrival of Altiero Spinelli and the birth of the Federalist Manifesto.
For 10 days, young people have taken part in the meeting, discussing European and world politics, always trying, according to Spinelli's teaching, to find and iron out the problems, and to take advantage of the options for action offered by history to men of goodwill.
1989 was a special year. The referendum in Italy, the prospect of a European currency, and of an economic and monetary union, to which both Mitterrand and Delors are deeply committed, seemed to duplicate the atmosphere of the 50s, the heroic times of the founding fathers.
Perhaps the struggle for a European Union is drawing to a conclusion at last?
Not by chance did the Federalists in Ventotene dedicate a good part of this year's activities to the world scene and to the possibility of action and collaboration with the World Federalists.
As Kit Pinot and Dieter Heinrich said at the end of the Second World War, the European Federalists and the World Federalists are splitting up to go their separate ways.
Yes, in the early days with the founding of the Federalist movement, there was a split between those people who felt that regional federation should be the first goal, and that perhaps world federation was a much larger and much more remote possibility, and so they wanted to work for regional federation directly. Others felt that perhaps regional federations would form competing blocks, and that they may in some senses become an obstacle to the ultimate goal of world federation. So there was a split in the movement in the early days.
We are concerned with developing the United Nations along federal principles, giving it the ability to make international law on behalf of the global community, the way European Federalists focus on creating a federation in Europe to do the same thing for Europe.
In the Southern Hemisphere as well, there is expectation for a message of hope, a model to follow.
I came to Ventotene to bring a message of hope from the African continent. The Club d'Afrique has the duty to fight for its ideas on African unity.
One comes to Ventotene to work seriously, but there is some leisure. The moments of amusement and relaxation are useful in order to get to know one another better and create a basis for united action once one is back in one's own city.
I think that many of you will become leaders of the Federalist movement, so we'll be able to meet again in Ventotene.
Despite all expectations, great changes have occurred both in the East and the West. Europe is once again at the forefront of the world scene. What can we expect if European Union becomes a reality?
Bisogna pensare che l'unità dell'Europa è un fatto grandioso, un fatto storico.
You must think that European unity is a grandiose historical step forward. Europe is the first example of international democracy, and it's the first real assertion of internationalism. It means a new way to see the relations between nations, not based on strength and violence, but upon right and law. And Europe can turn into a model that can solve not only European problems, but the world's problems as well. With perestroika and the democratic process that started in the Soviet Union and in Central Europe, the forces of renewal were freed, but also those of nationalism as well. The old prejudices are back and could undermine the positive influence of perestroika. Well, the federal model of the European community and the peace between France and Germany are necessary to the solution of Russia's internal problems and to the new organization of the people of Central Europe. This is also true for Africa, and it's true for Latin America. And of course, it's true on a world level as far as the superpowers are concerned. That's where we stand. Europe becomes a model to solve the world's problems. This is the meaning of European construction. And so we mustn't expect a significant change in our everyday lives. But with European unity, the Europeans will start to be citizens of the world. European citizens, world citizens. And that's what really matters.